Okay, so this video is going to go over 9.1 to 9.4 of understanding and using English grammar. Um, the PowerPoint doesn't contain all of the information, and the video doesn't contain all the information that's in the book. So it may be useful for you to have your book open to 162 and follow along and maybe add notes to some of the things that I'm saying that are not in the book, or also I may refer to some of the examples that are in the book as well. So again, it's starting on page 162. All right, so let's start off with a basic overview of what do we mean when we talk about modals. So there's the tenses that you've learned, like simple present tense, simple past tense, and future tense. When we're talking about modals, modals are used in English to express attitudes about something, right? The person's emotions or feelings about something. So some of the things they can express are that something's necessary, or that it's advisable, meaning it's a good idea, that it's permissible, meaning that it's allowed, that it's possible, or probable. Sorry, that's spelled wrong. And they can also indicate the strengths of those attitudes, meaning something is really necessary or just a little bit necessary. Something's really advisable or just a little bit advisable. So they fall into two categories. The first category is modal auxiliaries. And all of the ones that are in this category are ones that don't change regardless of the subject. They're actually not connected to tense at all. Because they're not used like in the past, present, or future. They may have a past, present, or future meaning in them, but they don't ever change. So the vast majority of them are just one word, but you can see that the words had better and ought to are two words. And the reason why I have ought to highlighted is that ought to is the only one from these groups that ends in to. One of the mistakes that we see in ESL sometimes is that people want to put modals, the word to after a modal, because in other languages that might happen. So people might say you must to do it, right? But with these ones, except for ought to, you're not going to use to. So if you look at this, in this one, the subject's I, it's can, she, it's can, they, it's can. It doesn't change at all. Now compare that with phrasal modals. And the phrasal modals, the first word of the phrasal modal is going to change depending on what the subject is and depending on what the tense is. So we see here, I forgot to highlight this one, but this first word, be in this case, is going to change depending on the subject. Have is going to change depending on the subject and also the tense. So for example, in the present tense, it would be I am able to do it, she is able to do it, they are able to do it, right? It's just this first word that is changed. And we'll notice that with all of these ones do have to. So they're using the infinitive as opposed to with ought to, that's the only one. So in the past tense, it would be I was able to do it, she was able to do it, they were able to do it. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. You're not ever going to be tested on is this a phrasal modal or if this is an auxiliary modal, but that's why those ones are put into two different categories. So moving on to the first one, this is on page 163. These are modals that express necessity. So there's three of them here. The first two, must and have to, have the basic meaning of expressing that something is necessary. In terms of testing, anytime on a test, if you're asked, both must and have to can be used in basically the same situation. There are some differences though between them that you should be aware of for using them in your daily life and using them in your writing. So when we look at have to, Have to is the more frequently used one in everyday speech and writing. Certainly in the United States, it's the more common than must in the sort of everyday necessitary. And what it means is that something similar to need to, right? So in the example, it says all applicants have to take an exam, or there's another one, I have to talk to her about our lunch date. I can't meet her for lunch because I have to go to a business meeting, right? So again, it's expressing that there's a need to do something. It's also the one that is used in questions more commonly than must. Must can be used in questions, but really in American English, you're not going to really use must very much in them. The word must, typically it has a stronger meaning when you're talking about necessity, and it indicates that there's an importance to it. Oftentimes in writing, you're going to see it in rules, written instructions, or legal information. It means something is very important to do, that it's very necessary to do. The other thing you want to keep in mind about using must in everyday conversation is that must is often used when adults are talking to young children to give them rules. So if you are talking to someone who is not a young child and you are saying you must do something, right? The person listening is likely to hear that as disrespectful, as though you are talking to them as though they are a child. In that situation, it would be better to say have to, right? You have to do something. Okay. Now the last one is have got to, and it also expresses a necessity, but it's really more used in informal English and in spoken English. So of these three, the one that is used in questions is going to be have to. You're not going to see must or have got to used in questions too much. So the next one here, moving over to page 165, is about lack of necessity, and the modal for that is not have to, and prohibition, which the modal for that is must not. So not have to indicates that something's not necessary, right? So this one actually is the opposite of the previous table. The previous table was talking about something was necessary. If you want to say that something is not necessary, you would say not have to, right? It means that something does not need to be done. It's not necessary to do it. Must not does not mean that something is not necessary. Must not means that something is not allowed, that it's either it's against the rules or it's something that the speaker really, really, really doesn't want the listener to do. Must not is very strong, right? And it's used to express rules prohibiting behavior or to strongly indicate that the speaker really does not want the listener to do something. The next one, or the last one here on page 167, is about advisability and suggestions. So we have 4 different modals here. And I'm going to focus here on what is the difference between them. So should and ought to can be used sort of the same way in expressing advisability, right? And meaning wise, should and ought to oftentimes can be used in the same situations. Should is obviously a lot more common than ought to, because my guess is a lot of you have never even heard ought to. It's pronounced oughta when people are speaking. But the word should is used to give advice, right? To give advice that the speaker thinks that something is a good idea, right? So if you say you should do this or you should do that, I, as the speaker, am saying this is what I believe is a good idea for you to do. Now, should can be used in negatives as well. So you can say you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that as well. Ought to also expresses advisability, but it's often connected with a statement about a responsibility or duty. So when we say that you ought to obey the speed limit, or you ought to do this, or you ought to do that, the added meaning that is not there with should is not just that I think that it's a good idea, but kind of society thinks it's a good idea because it's a responsibility or a duty for you, right? It's used to suggest that something's very important to do rather than it just being a good idea to do. Now, ought to is not really used in negatives. The next one is had better. And had better, again, is expressing advisability, but had better's use is much more limited than should or ought to. Definitely than should. When we say had better, we're giving a warning to someone, and the warning is that if you don't do this thing, that there may be possible bad consequences, that something bad might happen to you. So in the book, it has the example of the gas tank's almost empty. We had better stop at the next gas station, right? This is a warning that if we don't do this, we may run out of gas and then get stuck on the highway. Had better can also be used in negatives, right? So you can say you had better not steal, or you had better not cheat. Maybe that's better for my class. You'd better not cheat, or you might fail the class, right? That there's bad consequences for it. Now the word could, and we're going to see this word could later again in this chapter. So one of the things I forgot to mention in the beginning on the first slide is that many of these modals have more than one meaning, can be used in more than one way. It's the same word, but it can be used in different situations. So definitely you're going to see this with could. Could is going to come up a bunch. Should will also come up a bunch as well. Some of these, like ought to and had better, are more limited. But could is used to express suggestions. What it is used for is it's about possible actions. So someone is maybe asking for advice or is having a problem, right? I'm getting a bad grade in class. You could say, you could go and talk to your teacher, or you could get a tutor, or you could drop one class so that you have more time. When you're using could, you're not saying that this specific thing is the best idea. You're just saying it's a possible idea, and you're offering it up as a possibility for the listener to choose for, rather than giving specific advice as to what you think is the best idea. Okay, so hopefully this is helpful to you, and let me know. Let me know if it's not, I guess, but let me know if you have any questions. All right, see you in class.